power. No one in American history understood it, craved it, and wielded it with more raw, brutal force than Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was a tempest in human form, a man of enormous ambition who rose from poverty in Texas to become America's greatest paradox, a Southerner who freed black people, a humanist who started a brutal war, a politician who began his career by stealing votes, but used that power to build the great society. So who was he in the end? A saint or a sinner? This is the story of the man who built America's future while also sowing the seeds of its deepest divisions. To understand this man, you cannot begin in the polished halls of the White House. You must begin where he began, in a place of harsh beauty and crushing hardship, the Texas Hill Country. It was a land of thin soil and blinding sun, a place of flash floods and brutal droughts. The land was poor, and it bred a deep-seated insecurity in the people who tried to tame it. It taught you that life was a constant, desperate struggle, and it was this desperate struggle, this gnawing fear of poverty and failure, that became the central driving force of Lyndon Johnson's entire life. He was born in a tiny farmhouse near Stonewall, Texas, in 1908. He was the son of a talkative, backslapping politician named Sam Ely Johnson, Jr., a man who served in the state legislature, but who was a terrible businessman, constantly chasing get-rich-quick schemes that left his family teetering on the edge of ruin. From his father, Lyndon learned the folksy charm and the political deal-making of Texas politics, but he also learned the bitter humiliation of failure. His mother, Rebecca Baines Johnson, was a refined, educated woman who felt trapped by the harsh realities of country life. She poured all of her thwarted ambitions into her eldest son. She read him poetry, taught him history, and relentlessly pushed him to be something more than just another hill country farmer or small-town politician. This push and pull between his father's rough populism and his mother's cultured aspirations created a deep and lasting insecurity in Lyndon. He would spend his whole life trying to prove that he was not his father's failure and that he was worthy of his mother's dreams. He grew up with a desperate, almost physical hunger to escape. He saw what poverty did to people, how it broke their spirits and limited their horizons. After a brief, rebellious stint in California, he enrolled in the Southwest Texas State Teachers College. It was here that he had an experience that would mark him for life, a brief but profoundly formative chapter that is the key to understanding the compassion that wrestled with his ambition. In 1928, to earn money for his tuition, the 20-year-old Johnson took a year off to teach at the segregated Wellhausen School for Mexican-American children in the dusty border town of Cotulla, Texas. His students were desperately poor. They were the children of migrant farm workers, often coming to school hungry, without shoes, speaking little English. The school itself was a dilapidated shack next to the railroad tracks. For the first time in his life, Lyndon Johnson was confronted with a poverty and a racial prejudice that made the hardships of his own childhood pale in comparison. Confronted with this reality, his own ambition was suddenly matched by a profound and motivating anger. He poured his boundless, manic energy into the job. He cajoled the school board for more supplies. He started sports teams and debate clubs. He forced his students to speak English, but he also fought for them, protected them, and, in his own way, loved them. He saw their intelligence and their potential trapped behind a wall of systemic neglect and bigotry. Years later, as president, he would speak of this time with a raw, unvarnished emotion. "I shall never forget the faces of the boys and the girls in that little Wellhausen Mexican school," he would say, his voice thick with memory. "I remember even yet the pain of realizing and knowing then that college was closed to practically every one of those children because they were too poor. And I think it was then that I made up my mind that this nation could never rest while the door of knowledge and the door of opportunity was closed to any American. In the dust of Cotulla, the moral foundation of the Great Society was laid. But first there was the climb. After college, Johnson came to Washington, D.C. as a congressional aide and was immediately in his element. He was a whirlwind of energy and ambition. He saw that the true source of power in Washington was a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his New Deal. He became a passionate devotee of FDR, and in 1935, he was appointed the head of the National Youth Administration in Texas. He was just 26, but he ran the agency with ruthless efficiency, creating jobs and opportunities for thousands of young Texans, and in the process, building his own statewide network of political allies. In 1937, a seat in Congress opened up and Johnson jumped into the race. He ran as a wholehearted 100% New Dealer, and with a little help from his political patrons, he won. In Washington, Congressman Johnson was a man in a hurry. He used his boundless energy and his uncanny ability to cultivate powerful older men to his advantage. He became a protege of President Roosevelt himself and the powerful Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. He also married Claudia Alta Taylor, a quiet, intelligent, and shrewd businesswoman from East Texas. She was nicknamed Lady Bird, and she would become his most loyal advisor, his steadiest companion, and the calm center of his chaotic life. She grounded him, endured his colossal ego and his frequent infidelities, and provided the stable foundation upon which he would build his political empire. But Congress was too small a stage for his ambition. He wanted to be in the Senate, the exclusive club of the most powerful men in the country. He ran for a Senate seat in 1941, and in a close race, he lost. The defeat stung him, and he learned a bitter lesson from it. He believed the election had been stolen from him by his opponent's last-minute ballot stuffing. He vowed he would never let that happen again. His second chance came in 1948, in a race that would become legendary for its corruption. He was running against a popular conservative former governor named Coke Stevenson. The campaign was brutal and shameless, and when the votes were counted, it was astonishingly close. On the morning after the election, Stevenson was ahead by a few hundred votes. It seemed Lyndon Johnson had lost again. But then, days later, an amended return came in from the remote, dusty Jim Wells County in South Texas. A ballot box, designated Box 13, had supposedly been found. This box contained 202 additional votes. And by an amazing coincidence, 201 of those votes were for Lyndon Johnson, cast in alphabetical order in the same handwriting. These 202 votes were just enough to give Johnson a statewide victory by a margin of just 87 votes. Coke Stevenson cried foul, and the evidence of fraud was overwhelming. But Johnson, with his team of high-powered lawyers, including the future Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, fought the challenges all the way to the Supreme Court, tying the case up in legal knots until the election was certified. He had won. From that day forward, he would be mockingly known by his political enemies as Landslide Lyndon. The man who had gone to Cotulla to help the powerless had now clawed his way into the Senate by using the power of a corrupt political machine. This was the central conflict of his life, the compassionate idealist versus the ruthless, win-at-all-costs politician. He arrived in the United States Senate in 1949, a freshman senator with a tainted victory and a burning ambition. He was no longer the boy from the hill country, afraid of poverty. He was now a player in the most powerful legislative body on earth. He had learned the harsh lessons of his home state: be tough, be relentless, and do whatever it takes to get what you want. He was about to apply those lessons to the U.S. Senate, and in doing so, he would make himself its undisputed master. When Lyndon Baines Johnson arrived in the United States Senate in 1949, he was a freshman in a club run by old men. He was no longer the big man from Texas. He was a junior senator with a questionable election victory and a reputation for raw, naked ambition. A lesser man might have been intimidated. But for Johnson, the Senate was not a hallowed chamber of debate. It was an ecosystem of power, and he was determined to reach the top of its food chain. For the first few years, he was surprisingly quiet. He watched, he listened, and most importantly, he learned. He studied the Senate's arcane rules and traditions, but more than that, he studied the senators themselves. He learned their histories, their habits, their vanities, and their vices. He understood that the Senate ran on a complex economy of favors, debts, and personal relationships, and he set out to master it. His strategy was to attach himself to the most powerful man in the chamber, the unofficial leader of the Southern Bloc and a master of the legislative arts, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. Johnson adopted the role of the deferential, almost fawning protege. He courted Russell, did his bidding, and in the process, absorbed his mentor's encyclopedic knowledge of how to wield power within the institution. As he gained seniority, the true formidable force of his personality was unleashed. He perfected a legendary method of persuasion that would become known in Washington as the Johnson treatment. It was an overwhelming physical and psychological assault. Johnson was a huge man, 6'4", with large hands and an imposing presence. He would invade a fellow senator's personal space, grabbing him by the lapels, his face just inches away from his targets. Then came the barrage. He would flatter, he would cajole, he would whisper, and he would shout. He would poke his finger in your chest for emphasis. He would offer you a deal, promise you a dam for your home state, threaten you with political ruin, and tell you a dirty joke, all in the same breathless monologue. He was relentless, exhausting, and almost impossible to resist. One senator described it as being like a blizzard, a gully washer, a tropical storm. You just felt overwhelmed. This raw personal power, combined with his encyclopedic knowledge of the Senate, led to a rise of unprecedented speed. In 1953, after just 4 years in the chamber, he was elected Senate Minority Leader. 2 years later, when the Democrats regained control, he became the youngest Senate Majority Leader in American history. He then proceeded to transform the very nature of the job. Before him, the Majority Leader was a largely ceremonial position. Johnson turned it into the absolute nerve center of the United States government. He knew everything that was happening in the Senate. He knew every line of every bill. He knew which senators were having affairs, which ones had drinking problems, and which ones needed a new federal courthouse to help their re-election campaign. He controlled committee assignments. He controlled the legislative calendar, and through the force of the Johnson treatment, he controlled the votes. For the rest of the 1950s, Lyndon Johnson, not the amiable Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was arguably the most powerful man in Washington, but his power rested on a precarious balancing act. He was a Southerner, and his power base was the solid block of Southern segregationist senators. But he also had national ambitions, and he knew that to become president, he had to prove to the Northern liberals in his party that he was more than just another good old boy from Texas. His great test came in 1957. President Eisenhower had sent a modest civil rights bill to Congress. It was the first such legislation proposed since Reconstruction, and it faced a wall of absolute opposition from the South. Johnson's mentor, Richard Russell, and the other Southerners swore they would kill it with their most powerful weapon, the filibuster, an unending debate that could paralyze the Senate indefinitely. Johnson was now caught between two irreconcilable forces. If he supported the bill, he would betray his Southern allies and risk his entire power base. If he opposed it, he would forever be branded a racist by the liberal wing of his party, killing his presidential hopes. So he did what he did best. He went to work. In one of the most masterful displays of legislative maneuvering in history, Johnson navigated the treacherous path between them. He convinced his Southern colleagues that some kind of civil rights bill was inevitable, and it was better for them to allow a weak bill to pass than to fight a losing battle that would make them look like obstructionists. At the same time, he convinced the Northern liberals that a weak bill was better than no bill at all. It's just a half a loaf, he argued, but a half a loaf is better than none. He worked day and night, cajoling, threatening, and deal-making. He allowed the Southerners to gut the bill's most powerful enforcement provisions. But then, in a stunning move, he broke their filibuster and brought the Civil Rights Act of 1957 to a final vote. It passed. It was a severely weakened, almost symbolic piece of legislation, but it was a victory. He had passed the first civil rights bill in 82 years, and he had done it without destroying his relationship with the South. He had proven he was a national leader. His ambition, however, was aimed at the White House. In 1960, he made his own run for the presidency, but his brand of backroom, strong-arm politics was no match for the youthful, charismatic appeal of John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy campaign was sleek, modern, and media-savvy. Johnson's was old-fashioned and clunky. He was soundly defeated in the primaries. Then Kennedy made a stunning offer: the vice presidency. Everyone, including Kennedy's own brother Robert, was shocked when Johnson accepted. Why would the most powerful man in the Senate trade it all for the notoriously powerless office of the vice president? Johnson saw it as his only path to the presidency, a way to balance the ticket and bring the South along for the young Catholic from Massachusetts. But the Kennedy years were a period of deep frustration and quiet humiliation for Lyndon Johnson. He was completely shut out of the real centers of power. The Kennedy White House was a glamorous world of Camelot, run by a tight-knit circle of brilliant, often arrogant intellectuals from Harvard. They viewed the towering Texan with a mixture of fear and contempt. They mocked his folksy accent, his crude stories, and his unpolished manners behind his back. Johnson, the master of power, was now a political afterthought, sent on meaningless goodwill tours abroad and given little of substance to do at home. He chafed under the Kennedy brothers, feeling emasculated and disrespected. He was a man of immense energy with no real outlet, a political predator trapped in a gilded cage. Then came November 22nd, 1963. The presidential motorcade was traveling through Dallas, Texas, on a political trip meant to heal a bitter rift in the state's Democratic Party. President Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline were in the lead limousine. Vice President Johnson and Lady Bird were 2 cars behind. It was a bright, sunny day, and the crowds were enormous. Suddenly, the sound of rifle shots cracked through the air. In Johnson's car, a Secret Service agent, Rufus Youngblood, immediately shoved the vice president to the floor, shouting, "Get down! Get down!" Johnson was pinned to the floor of the car as it sped away from the chaos of Dealey Plaza, his face pressed into the shoulder of the agent protecting him. They raced to Parkland Memorial Hospital. For a short, terrifying time, no one knew the full extent of what had happened. Then, the grim news came. The president was dead. In that moment of horror and confusion, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the forgotten vice president, became the 36th president of the United States. The hours that followed were a surreal and somber blur. The Secret Service, fearing a wider conspiracy, rushed Johnson to Air Force One at Love Field Airport. They insisted he take the oath of office immediately before the plane could leave the ground. A federal judge was summoned. A small, stunned group of aides and officials crowded into the sweltering cabin of the presidential plane. And there, one of the most haunting and iconic images in American history was created. A grim-faced Lyndon Johnson stood with his right hand raised, his left hand on a small Catholic missal found on the plane. To his right stood his wife, Lady Bird, her face a mask of composure, and to his left, in a profound symbol of the nation's trauma and the continuity of power, stood the now widowed Jacqueline Kennedy, her pink suit still stained with her husband's blood. As he recited the words, "I do solemnly swear," the power of the American presidency was transferred. The accidental president, the Southerner who had been mocked by the men of Camelot, was now their leader. He was inheriting a nation paralyzed by grief, a slain president's unfinished agenda, and a world holding its breath. The great test of his life, the moment he had craved and maneuvered for his entire career, had arrived in the worst possible way. Lyndon Baines Johnson became president in a moment of profound national trauma. The nation was paralyzed by grief. Its youthful, charismatic leader struck down. In his place was a man who seemed to be everything John F. Kennedy was not: a crude, old-school political operator from Texas, a Southerner inheriting the mantle of a Northern icon. The world watched and the nation waited, wondering if this accidental president could possibly steady the ship. But what few understood was that Lyndon Johnson had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The man who had craved power with every fiber of his being now possessed it, and he was determined to use it in a way no one could have imagined. 5 days after the assassination, he went before a joint session of Congress, and a nation still raw with grief. He was not there just to mourn, he was there to lead. He began by invoking the martyred president. "All I have," he said in his slow Texas drawl, "I would have given gladly not to be standing here today." Then, in a moment of political genius, he masterfully seized Kennedy's legacy and made it his own. He declared that the greatest way to honor President Kennedy's memory was not through eulogies, but through action. And the first order of business, he announced, was the passage of the stalled Civil Rights Bill. He leaned into the microphone and issued a call to arms that electrified the chamber. "Let us continue." In that moment, Johnson transformed himself from an heir into a leader. He knew that President Kennedy's domestic agenda, including a major tax cut and the Civil Rights Bill, was hopelessly stuck in Congress, held hostage by a coalition of conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats. But where Kennedy had been cautious and deferential to Congress, Johnson was a storm of focused energy. He was now back in his element, the world of legislative deal-making, and he was its undisputed master. He immediately unleashed the full, terrifying force of the Johnson treatment, now amplified by the power of the presidency. He summoned congressmen and senators to the Oval Office, one by one. He flattered, he threatened, he pleaded, and he bargained. He got on the phone, a restless giant pacing the Oval Office, making dozens of calls a day, using his intimate knowledge of each man's fears and desires to make them compliant. His main target was the Civil Rights Act, a bill that aimed to outlaw segregation in public places and discrimination in employment. It was being blocked by the Southern Bloc, led by his own former mentor, Richard Russell. In a now legendary phone call, Johnson pleaded with Russell, the man he revered like a father, to get out of his way. "Dick," Johnson said, his voice a mixture of respect and iron resolve, "I love you, and I'm going to tell you something. You've got to get on board. This is a moral issue." When the bill reached the Senate floor, the Southerners launched the longest filibuster in Senate history, holding the chamber hostage for 75 days. But Johnson was relentless. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, forging a bipartisan coalition, peeling off moderate Republicans, and keeping the pressure on 24 hours a day. And in June of 1964, he did what everyone had said was impossible. He broke the Southern filibuster. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed the Senate and was signed into law. It was the most sweeping and consequential piece of civil rights legislation in nearly a century. And it was a personal moral triumph for the man from the segregated South. But as he laid down his pen after signing the bill, the master politician in him understood the immense political cost. He turned to a young aide, Bill Moyers, and said with a grim sense of fatalism, "I think we have just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." With the Civil Rights Act passed and a major tax cut enacted, Johnson turned his attention to his own, even grander vision. He had declared an unconditional war on poverty in America, and now he began to sketch out the details of what he called the Great Society, a nation free from poverty and racial injustice, a place where every child had the chance to enrich their mind and enlarge their talents. First, however, he needed a mandate of his own. In the presidential election of 1964, he faced the arch-conservative Republican Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Johnson masterfully portrayed himself as the responsible moderate heir to Kennedy, and Goldwater as a dangerous extremist who would abolish Social Security and might recklessly stumble into a nuclear war. His campaign produced one of the most famous and devastating political advertisements in history. Known as the Daisy ad, it showed a small girl plucking the petals from a daisy, her innocent counting giving way to a cold, methodical countdown, which then dissolves into the horrifying mushroom cloud of a nuclear explosion. The ad only aired once, but its message was clear and terrifying. The result was the biggest landslide victory in American history. Johnson won with over 61% of the popular vote and carried 44 states. He now had what he had always craved, a mandate. He was no longer the accidental president. He was president of the United States in his own right, with overwhelming Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate. The stage was set for a legislative storm, unlike any the nation had ever seen. What followed in 1965 was a year of almost unbelievable legislative achievement. With his huge majorities in Congress and with his unparalleled skill at persuasion and intimidation, Johnson pushed through a flood of landmark bills that would become the pillars of his great society. The catalyst for his next great civil rights victory was the city of Selma, Alabama. In March 1965, peaceful voting rights marchers were brutally attacked and beaten by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in an event that became known as Bloody Sunday. The televised images of the violence shocked the conscience of the nation. Johnson seized the moral high ground. He went before a joint session of Congress and delivered the greatest speech of his life. He condemned the violence in Selma and demanded the passage of a new bill to guarantee the right to vote for all Americans. And then, in a moment that sent shivers down the spine of the nation, the Southern president adopted the anthem of the civil rights movement as his own. He raised his arms and declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "And we shall overcome." The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed just months later. It was even more revolutionary than the Civil Rights Act. It suspended literacy tests and sent federal examiners into the South to register black voters directly. In the years that followed, millions of African Americans were registered to vote, and the political landscape of the South was transformed forever. It was the crown jewel of the Great Society. But Johnson was just getting started. The legislative tsunami continued. He passed Medicare, a program providing federal health insurance for the elderly. He passed Medicaid, providing health care for the poor. He pushed through the first major federal aid to education, the creation of the Head Start program for preschool children, major immigration reform that ended the old racist quota system, and the creation of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Public Broadcasting Corporation, PBS. He was, at a breathtaking pace, using the full power of the federal government to build a new, more just, and more compassionate America. But even as Lyndon Johnson was achieving these triumphs at home, a conflict on the other side of the world was quietly escalating into a threat that would consume his presidency. A small, faraway country called Vietnam, a place most Americans could not find on a map, was becoming an ever larger obsession. He had inherited a limited American commitment from President Kennedy, a few thousand military advisors meant to prop up the anti-communist government of South Vietnam. In August of 1964, in the middle of his presidential campaign, an event occurred that would change everything. The White House reported that an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, had been the victim of an unprovoked attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, a second attack was reported. The historical record now shows that the first attack was not unprovoked, and the second attack almost certainly never happened. But Johnson used the incident to go to Congress and ask for a resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, passed almost unanimously, gave the president a virtual blank check to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It was the legal foundation upon which the entire Vietnam War would be built. Then, in the winter and spring of 1965, at the very same time he was masterminding the passage of the Voting Rights Act and Medicare, he was making a series of fateful secret decisions. Following an attack on an American air base, he authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained large-scale bombing campaign against North Vietnam. And in March 1965, he sent the first official U.S. ground combat troops, a battalion of Marines, to South Vietnam. He made these decisions almost as an afterthought, a secondary problem to be managed, while his real focus was on his Great Society. He was convinced it would be a short, limited conflict to convince the North Vietnamese to back down. He was a man who believed any problem could be solved by applying enough pressure, enough force. It was a tragic, catastrophic miscalculation. And so, at the end of 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson stood at the absolute apex of his power. He had passed more significant domestic legislation than any president since his hero, Franklin Roosevelt. He had shattered the legal foundations of segregation and fulfilled the promise of civil rights in a way no one had thought possible. He was the undisputed master of the political universe. But the small, nagging war in Southeast Asia was growing. The number of troops was quietly escalating. The president who dreamed of being remembered as the great domestic reformer had just tied his fate and the nation's to a distant war he did not understand, a war that was about to consume his presidency, his legacy, and his soul. In 1966, Lyndon Johnson stood like a colossus astride the American political world. He was the master of all he surveyed, signing into law the final, ambitious pillars of his great society. But as he dedicated one hand to building a more just nation at home, his other hand was committed to an escalating, brutalizing war in a faraway land. These two sides of his presidency, the compassionate reformer and the stubborn warrior, were now locked in a fatal conflict. The war in Vietnam and the war on poverty were at war with each other, and only one could survive. The American strategy in Vietnam, conceived by General William Westmoreland and approved by Johnson, was a grim industrial-style conflict called a war of attrition. The goal was not to capture territory, but simply to kill enemy soldiers faster than North Vietnam could replace them. Success was measured in a ghastly nightly metric, the body count. Johnson, the master persuader, believed that if he just applied enough military pressure, enough force, the enemy would eventually break and come to the negotiating table. And so he escalated. The number of American troops in Vietnam swelled from less than 200,000 at the end of 1965 to nearly 500,000 by 1967. With each new troop deployment, with each new bombing campaign, the American public was assured that progress was being made, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. But this was the first war to be broadcast in color into American living rooms every night. And what the American people saw on their television screens was a bloody, chaotic, and morally confusing reality that seemed to have no end. They saw American boys dying in nameless rice paddies and jungles. They saw villages being burned. This chasm between the optimistic reports from Washington and the brutal images on the evening news created something new in American life, a credibility gap. For the first time, a majority of Americans began to believe that their president was lying to them. As the war dragged on, a protest movement that had begun on college campuses grew into a massive nationwide force. At first, Johnson dismissed the protesters as a fringe group of nervous Nellies and hippies. But soon, the crowds in the streets numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They marched on the Pentagon. They surrounded the White House. For Lyndon Johnson, a man who craved love and consensus more than anything, this was a personal agony. He was a man who wanted to be a father to the nation, to be loved and admired. Instead, he became one of the most hated men in America. He would lie awake at night in the White House, listening to the crowds outside chanting their vicious, searing slogan, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" He became a prisoner in the White House, obsessed with news reports, his moods swinging wildly with every minor battlefield report. The war was not just a political crisis, it was consuming his soul. It was also destroying his dream. The immense cost of the Vietnam War began to starve the programs of his great society. The war on poverty was being lost on the battlefields of Vietnam. The dream of building a just society at home was being sacrificed on the battlefields of Southeast Asia. It was the ultimate heartbreaking tragedy of his presidency. Then came 1968, the year America seemed to come apart at the seams. On January 31st, during the Vietnamese New Year's holiday known as Tet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched a massive coordinated surprise attack on cities and military bases all across South Vietnam. They even breached the walls of the American embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the communists. They were beaten back with devastating losses. But politically and psychologically, it was a catastrophic defeat for the United States. The offensive shattered the illusion that the U.S. was winning the war. If the enemy was capable of launching an attack of this scale, then all the official optimism, all the body counts, had been a lie. The most trusted man in America, the CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, went to Vietnam and returned to deliver a televised editorial. He looked into the camera and declared that the war was a bloody stalemate. In the White House, Johnson watched and, according to legend, he turned to an aide and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The political fallout was immediate. Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, running for president on an anti-war platform, nearly defeated Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. It was a stunning sign of the president's vulnerability. A few days later, his old nemesis, Robert F. Kennedy, announced that he too would run for the presidency. Johnson was now facing a brutal, divisive civil war within his own party. The man who prided himself on his political invincibility was now cornered. On the evening of March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson went on national television to address the nation about the war. He announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and a renewed push for peace talks. The nation listened intently, and then at the very end of the speech, he looked directly into the camera and delivered the most shocking political statement of the 20th century. "With America's sons in the fields far away," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his office, "with America's future under challenge right here at home, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." A stunned silence fell across the country. In a single stunning moment, the most powerful man in the world had surrendered. The ultimate political fighter, the man who had clawed his way to the top, had just walked away from the prize. He served out the final 10 months of his term as a lame duck, a sad and diminished figure watching as the chaotic year of 1968 unfolded. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the riots that burned American cities, and the violent Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In January 1969, he returned home to his beloved LBJ Ranch in the Texas Hill Country. He let his hair grow long, drove his guests wildly around his property in his convertible, and spent his days trying to secure his place in history, building his presidential library and working on his memoirs. He was a man haunted by what might have been, a restless ghost wandering the land that had forged him. He died of a massive heart attack on January 22, 1973, just 5 days before the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending America's direct involvement in the Vietnam War. He did not live to see the final humiliating fall of Saigon 2 years later. So how, in the end, do we measure a man like Lyndon Baines Johnson? He remains one of the most polarizing and paradoxical figures in American history. Was he a great president? If you look at his domestic achievements, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, the answer is an undeniable yes. He did more to advance the cause of social justice than any president of the 20th century. But if you look at the 58,000 American lives and the millions of Vietnamese lives lost in a war he deepened and prolonged, a war that shattered the nation's trust in its government, the answer is a resounding no. In the end, his presidency is a study in contradiction, a man of immense gifts and equally immense flaws. His boundless ambition, born from a deep-seated insecurity, drove him to achieve incredible good and to cause unimaginable suffering. He was a man who truly wanted to heal the poor and uplift the downtrodden, but who also brought so much death and division. His story reveals how the same ambition that drives a person to build a more just world can also lead them to cause immeasurable destruction, a lesson on the awesome and often tragic nature of power itself.